Hello, I'm Panos Kotzathanasis, and this is Asian Movie Pulse Interviews. Today I'm here with Ema Ryan Yamazaki, whose film The Making of a Japanese is soon screening in Thessaloniki Documentary Film Festival. How are you, Emma?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. So, first I have some technical questions, let's say, in quotes. The particular school that features in the documentary, okay, I understand it's public, not private, but would you say it's like top tier or an average school, more or less?
We tried to pick a typical Japanese public school. It is unique in the sense that it's quite a big one. There was almost 1,000 children in the school, and it is in a suburb of Tokyo, so it's quite urban. Although we picked a region that is not the super city center, it's kind of like a suburb, far away from any kind of train stations, and it could be kind of feel like any kind of suburb in that area of Japan. So we did try to pick a school that represents what could be a school across the country. So that's what we were going for.
Mhm. Okay, and this is the cheeky Greek guy in me asking, but would you say that if the fact that the camera was there made things a little bit better than they usually are, or is it always like that?
It's interesting. I feel like your first two questions is already telling me that you thought the this Japanese school was like very good or something
Yeah.
compared to maybe what you're used to. But I would say that we were there for the whole school year. We filmed for 150 days. So not every single school day, but pretty much every day. And so um I think it's easy to pretend for a few days, but eventually we were just part of the system. And especially for the grade one students that are the main characters in our film, we were there from the first day of their elementary school life. So they just didn't know any difference. Like we were part of
Mm.
the system. I always like to think that maybe they went to second grade and we were no longer filming them and they were like, where's the camera? It was such a part of the environment. So I don't know, of course, having a camera there always affects anything, but I don't think that it's just that's why I wanted to be there as much as possible because I wanted to kind of be part of the system to the point where the teachers, the kids, they just can't bother to think that we're there or not and act differently. We just wanted them in their natural habitat. So we did do our best to kind of like create an environment where, we were just not invisible. It's impossible to be invisible, but their presence should not be felt so much so that what you see in the film is representative of what would be there even if we weren't there.
Mhm. And also, from what the documentary shows, in the first grade, they just do these things about how to clean, let's say, or how to behave, or how to serve, but they don't do like, I don't know, language or math or whatever we do in Europe. What is the curriculum, more or less?
Of course, a Japanese elementary school, like any elementary school around the world, of course, children are learning math, basic language skills, and introduction to social science and other sciences and things like that. We just don't feature that so much in the film because I wanted to pick the parts that are kind of more unique to the Japanese system in a way that the classes that are like the education moments that are in between those academic classes. It's not so interesting to see a 6-year-old learn how to count from 1 to 10 or the Japanese alphabet. So of course that happens. And we did film a lot of that, waiting for some irregular life lesson or something. But ultimately, it's true that you don't see so much of that in the film because I think it's kind of similar anywhere in the world.
Mhm. And the title of the documentary refers to how the Japanese are shaped, let's say. So, do you feel that Japanese in general people are shaped at elementary level?
Yes, this was the reason I made the film. I grew up in Japan and I went to a Japanese public elementary school like the one you see in my film. And my father is British, and I actually also after elementary school kind of went a more Western path. I went to an American international school, then I moved to New York for many years. So I look back at my own identity and realize that the Japaneseness in me, everything I learned about being Japanese, I learned in those 6 years in elementary school. And because it is so uniform wherever you go in the country, what you see in my film is typically what people learn. And you do learn these basic values that you take for granted, like cleaning your own classroom and serving each other lunch, things I thought were universal, but it's actually not. It's only in Japan. And so looking back, my thesis to do this film was, it just feels like when you're 5 years old, a Japanese 5-year-old, or maybe a Greek 5-year-old, or an American 5-year-old, they're all pretty similar. They're just a child. But by the time you're 12 years old, which is when you graduated Japanese elementary school, it just seemed like you were very Japanese if you have gone through a Japanese school system. So in my view, these 6 years just seemed like the foundation of what I was seeing in Japanese society. But in a way, for better or for worse, the strengths, sometimes the weaknesses. And that's why I wanted to follow the incoming first graders who are learning everything for the first time, as well as the outgoing sixth graders, the oldest grade, to see what you learn and kind of imagine those first graders also learning in those 6 years, because I do think it's a kind of a mirror of what's going on in society or what might be happening when they get older, when they enter Japanese society itself.
Mhm. And when you started shooting, had the pandemic already started, or was it after you began?
So yeah, it took me like 6 years to find a school that would let me film. And we were all set up to film from April of 2020. And as we all know, March of 2020, COVID started, and it was just impossible to go forward. But actually, we decided to film the following year, and from April 2021 through to March 2022. So it was still the pandemic. It was the second year, really. We maybe hoped that during the filming COVID would end. It didn't, but it was during the pandemic. I had a choice to make, should I do it this year or kind of wait 5 years and start all over after COVID? But actually, I thought that the themes that I wanted to explore were accentuated during COVID. I think COVID brought out the different characteristics of our cultures wherever we were. Different societies dealt with COVID in a different way. And I think the Japanese school system and what you see in my film kind of accentuated these themes of Japan handling this kind of like a pandemic in its own way. It's amazing in Japan. Schools were only closed for 2 or 3 months after COVID started, whereas I know in other countries it was closed for many more months, but at a human sacrifice, right? So the children were, they couldn't talk really, they couldn't touch anything, they were masked. There was a lot of personal sacrifice, but it's already part of the culture to serve your community. So kind of sacrifice yourself for the betterment of the group. That's already part of our culture. So I think you saw that accentuated during COVID times. So we decided to make the film during COVID anyway, even though the idea happened way before COVID happened, because we thought these themes you could even see more vividly during this time.
Mhm. And so, since we are mentioning the topic, would you say that the Japanese handled the pandemic better than other countries, or what do you think about it?
I think if you just look at the kind of the data of, for example, how many people passed and things like this, I think it's the case that Japan handled COVID better than many other places in the world. But it's interesting because, and I think that is because of this inherent, we already wore masks if we had a cold, because the idea of inconveniencing someone else was not okay already. So it was just part of it, or just again like the sacrifice of an individual for the betterment of the group is just part of our culture. But I think in a way it also brought out hidden kind of worst parts of Japan. Like in Japan, if you caught COVID, you were blamed for like, why did you get sick? And people were ashamed and people didn't say, or people would hide. There were just a lot of also things that it's not really how you think, right? Like it's not really your fault. I feel like in the West, if you got COVID, it's just part of the course. But there's different ways that Japan dealt with it, because it is such like a group mentality that to cause inconvenience to the group is it's a big deal. So in a way, there were some of the ugly parts of Japanese mentality that also came out. But I do think overall, this idea of thinking of things that are bigger than yourself, like we were prepared for dealing with COVID, and also because we're in a country where we're taught that a big earthquake can happen at any moment, and just to be prepared for that, we have to be responsible for our own part in handling that. And whether when elementary school student you're taught, do your homework, be kind, be responsible for yourself and your friends, take care of each other. It's just part of growing up. So I think that was kind of transferred over to the COVID pandemic years. And I think that kind of did help kind of minimize the death toll and things like this. We'll see about the long lasting mental effects of what we had to kind of ask, especially the kids, to go through. But I think that's also the true in like everywhere in the world. So I think, yes, like I think that in a way, that's why I hope that, you know, the world can learn about the Japanese school system, at least the communal aspects of how we're just taught to take care of each other, because I do think humanity is going to need that in the 21st century. But of course, it comes with some cost too. So I think the film shows both sides of that.
And also, I felt that the first graders, in comparison again to the European system, let's say, they have a lot of responsibilities, and they learn things like, you know, this thing, you serving of food, let's say, that we in Europe may never learn how to do it, actually. But at the same time, I felt that sometimes there is a little bit more pressure towards both them and the teachers to perform and be part of the community, let's say. Do you feel that also?
Yeah, I think you definitely hit right the point there. You know, I think in a way in Japan, young children are given responsibility in a way that I think is sometimes baffling for the Western communities, you know. But I also think that's an amazing thing that maybe the world can learn from, because when you're 6 years old and you're told that you're in charge of opening the windows every morning, or you're in charge of turning on the classroom lights, or you're in charge of, you know, making sure the blackboard is clean, or you're in charge of, you know, serving lunch to your friends that day, the kids are so excited. They think it's like the greatest honor. They don't think it's a burden. They don't think it's extra work. And when you start that young, I think it's just part of your characteristic to want to be responsible for things. And I think there's a lot more pluses in that than minuses. And if it's taught early, I think it just becomes part of who you are. And I think that's why Japan is known as a society kind of like being responsible for the trains running on time. Like these kind of societal traits, I think is because of this personal responsibility we learn just inherently. But as you said, kind of the flip side of that is like there's a lot of kind of like pressure put on young children too, to do your part, to be responsible, to also not cause inconvenience to the group. If you don't do your part, the lights won't turn on in the classroom. You know, this is like an extreme example. Or if you drop the lunch, then your friends might not have lunch that day. It's kind of like a double-edged sword but it's like a pressure. And you know, I remember when I was a kid, feeling the both sides, that feeling the accomplishment of achieving something when you're responsible and being successful is this feeling that carries me to my adulthood, of like kind of the foundation of who I am. But of course, when you face failure or things like that, of course, for some kids it's too much. Or but I do think like such a strength of the Japanese society is kind of full of people that are resilient, like have overcome different kind of hardships to kind of, it's like a character building society, or it has been until now. That I think that's why, you know, we don't have like these individual superstars in Japan, but we're known to kind of have this great economy, you know, in the post-war era, things like that. So it is all connected, and I do think there's things that are good about it, but it's all in how much degree. I think in my film you see teachers wondering, you know, how much should we push these children, how strict should we be, you know, maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago it was okay to be a certain way, but now parents want different things. You know, it seems like even for me, you know, from my time, these children are a bit more not as kind of hard skinned. They want to be praised. They're like, they don't want to be criticized. They don't have the ability, it seems like, to face adversity in the way that I feel like we were just told to like get over it and we'll cry and move on. But kids are handled a bit more in a good way, with kind of human rights, like kids have rights too, and they should be, their feelings are important, things like that. But it's all a balance, I think. And I think it's interesting in any society to observe how the kids are being treated, because they're our future. So I wonder, you know, if Japan is becoming a little bit less strict, a little bit more, you know, catering to individual needs, which is all a good thing. But then maybe in 30 years, our society will be a bit different. Maybe our trains will be a little bit late, a few minutes, you know, just because of it's all connected. And I think you can't have it all. So I try to point out in my film, you know, what I'm interested in doing is kind of showing that it's all related. And I don't know what the answers are. I don't know what the best society might be for Japan or any other place, but I like to connect the dots in a way that you can't have it all. So where do we want to, how do we want to educate our kids? What do we want for our societies in the future?
And the film also touches briefly the concept of suicide when the advisor comes at the school. So can you tell me a bit about that? Because at some point he mentions that maybe the training system, the education system is part of the problem. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, generally I approach this project with an admiration for the Japanese school system. As I mentioned, when I looked back at my upbringing, I think just it being so normal to help each other and kind of be responsible for yourself and your friends was a good thing about me, and kind of like learning that work ethic, that discipline I did as a kid. Like when I lived in New York for almost a decade, and people just would tell me I'm very hardworking, even though I think I'm just a normal Japanese person. So there were a lot of advantages. But I think, in a way, the system is so rigid. And at least in my time, it was kind of like there was like a main path of how you become an adult. And if you're a little bit different or you don't quite fit the school system, it's much harder. And I think when you fall off that main path of how you're supposed to be a Japanese, it's very difficult for kids who feel different. And I think as a result, we do have a society where, we're known kind of internationally to be this like, like I think people love Japan, the idea of Japan, we're kind of advanced in technology and this kind of cool Japan image. But, our suicide rate as a country, I think, is one of the highest in the world. And there's like a lot of kind of unhappiness, I think, in society that I think is because of this feeling that there's like a correct way to be Japanese, and if you're not that, there's still like difficulty in figuring out how to fit in. And I think in my film, you see children learning about who they are as a person in relation to the group, the community they're a part of, which I think in an elementary school works quite well. But as you get older, maybe in middle school and high school, and also as you become an adult, if who you are is tied only to in relation to the community or the group you're a part of, that's quite suffocating. I think for me too, I grew up kind of as a half Japanese person, wishing I looked more Japanese sometimes, not being fully accepted I was different. And I think for me, it was also difficult, and I didn't quite figure out a way to be happy when I was younger in Japan. It's a part of the reason I left to go to New York for a while. So it's complicated, and I think so the system itself is a double-edged sword. I do think that things are changing. I think there's a recognition that we have to treat kids more as individuals and not as a group. Compared to my time, Japan is evolving that way. But so we just have to keep in mind, like, keep the good things intact and also recognize the things that kind of need updating. I also don't think it's a good idea though to just like look to the West and copy it all, which sometimes Japan likes to do. But I think we have to recognize like some of the system is wonderful and is unique. I think people in Japan don't realize that we're the only country really that teaches our kids to clean our classrooms. And I think that's something that we should be proud of and should keep, because it just teaches you so much. But at the same time, we also have to recognize like, that we have to, that balance of kind of, restrictions and freedom, also the balance of like individuality versus responsibility to the group. It's all a balance, and I don't have the answers, but I like to pose these questions so that people have a chance to think about it for themselves.
And there's also another scene that stayed on my mind when there is one student is helping another one, but the teacher tells him or her, I don't remember actually, that you're not doing him good by helping him, and essentially, okay, help, but don't do it in the expense of yourself. So can you tell me a bit about that? It was very impressive.
Yes, I remember. So Yutaro, one of our main first grade boys, so he comes in as a kind of a wild child. He's running around the halls being taught you have to walk properly. There's one of these kids, I think, that you see in my film in the course of one school year, that the system, he learns from the system and he tries to be a good student. He wants to do as the teacher says. But part of it, I think he becomes so, he just wants to, all these, he's like, there's these friends who are asking him to help them fold these papers. And he does so much of that he didn't finish his own assignment. And I think it was an interesting moment where he became so much part of like wanting to help others that he actually forgot about himself in a way, or didn't know how to prioritize himself first. And the teacher realizes that. And I thought it was a wonderful moment for the teacher to say, like, of course you should help others, but hey, like the friends need to recognize he needs to do his own thing too, and he has to learn to stand up for himself. I think this is a quality that Japanese people can be better at in a way. Like I think every scene in my film, I'm either trying to, I have like hope for more of this, or kind of poses it as like, do we really want this? Like I'm in my mind, I'm kind of doing a mixture in the film to kind of show different hopes I have for my country and the system too. And that's one of those moments where I think in a way, sometimes as a kid in Japan, you learn so much about helping, and it's all important, but I think we also have to stand up for ourselves as individuals. And I thought it was a great moment that the teacher caught that. And I think that boy, ultimately, he's kind of the symbol of growth in my film, where he gets enough of the system. He learns how to be part of his class, a responsible, being in his community. But you see him at the end where he's, wildly riding on his bicycle. He's still himself. And I think if we can find that balance of individual and group the way Yutaro does in my film, that's kind of my hope. Like I think that's a good balance for me. Him as a character was what my hope character in a way in my film.
And you also have some scenes that happen in the house, in the apartments of the students. So was that difficult, getting permission during pandemic to go there? How was that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole filming of everything was very difficult in the pandemic, but also I knew we needed to go to the kids' houses sometimes, because as you see at school, they always have to be masked except when they're eating. And I just know in a film, like, you just need to see their faces sometimes. And also, I didn't want any interviews or narration of me as the director in the film, but it was also very hard to interview the kids because they're 6 years old. So I used the parents sometimes. The parents would ask the kids the questions, and I think that's the way I could understand how they were feeling. So for different reasons, the house environment was important. And, of course, I needed to find the families that were comfortable with it, were excited by the idea of being documented the way. And so it's always a challenge to find that. In this case, we filmed with many, 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 many more families than you'll ever see in my film. So it's always like, we filmed 700 hours, by the way, for this film. So there's a lot of footage that you don't see and a lot of characters, but I also like to take everything I experience and kind of condense it into the 90 something minutes you see in the film. So yes, it's always a negotiation process, but there's always people that see the benefit. We really felt like we were documenting kind of a historic year. I think as time passes and the pandemic is even further away from us in 5, 10, 20 years, some of that will also just become a record of history. And I think I felt that, and I think the families that participated understood. Of course, we're very careful, and we're taking COVID tests all the time to make sure that we weren't causing any extra danger. But I'm very grateful, in a documentary, you always have to, you rely on your subjects who want to be part of something like this to tell your story. And so we found those families, and they're in the film.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned how many hours you were shooting, how much time did it take you to edit the film?
I mean, it basically took a year, I think, for the film to be fully edited, even though, of course, we were kind of editing along the way. We were trying, it was just so much footage every day that I needed to check every weekend, figure out what we had and what we needed. And we had one camera. So, every day, every hour of the day, I would be deciding to film this class instead of that class. And as you see in the film, the school is the main character. It's not one student or one teacher. So we just had to constantly make decisions about what we would film and then how we would combine it. I also filmed until I was like 8 months pregnant, and then gave birth, and then had the baby and edited while I was having a newborn. So that I think also just created the kind of the length of it. But I also think it was very meaningful for me to have a child while making this film, thinking about also my son, who is Japanese, but my husband and is American. We live in Japan. What does this mean for this child? The making of a Japanese, like I'm also Japanese, but not really. Like it was all kind of like an editing process that made me think even more, I think. And so it was a complicated film to put together, but I knew that. I started as an editor, and I think the editing process is really where you figure out what you're actually trying to do. And so yes, it took, I think, about a year ultimately, which is a long time. Yeah.
So I guess your son will go to a Japanese elementary?
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, no system is perfect, and not to say I know every single school system out there, but I saw so much of the Japanese school system, and I put it in my film. I also saw things that are not in the film just for various reasons, and it's not a perfect system, but I do really believe that for that age group, for grade 1 to grade 6, there's just so many valuable lessons that the Japanese school system teaches you that I think I would happily I want my son to experience it. I think the question is for Japan, that's elementary school. I'm not an expert in middle school or high school, but I think if that same system continues when you're a bit older and you want to be more of an individual in your teenager and you have to have your own identity, I think that's where, maybe the more complicated questions come about the Japanese school system. But for elementary school, despite, again, it's not a perfect system, but I do really believe that it's one of the best systems in the world for kids that age. So yes, I think I think my husband and I want to put our son into a Japanese elementary school.
Mhm, mhm. And in general, how would you describe the Japanese movie industry at the moment, particularly regarding documentaries? Is there enough space for documentaries, you would say?
Ooh, good question. I think for me, I'm kind of in this unique situation where I left Japan to study filmmaking. I was in New York. I started my career there. I have access to, I obviously speak English, and I kind of learned how to make documentaries outside of Japan. And now I'm back in Japan trying to tell Japanese stories kind of in a unique way, the way I see it. I think in general, like documentaries in Japan, the industry is not yet mature in the way that, for example, the New York, the American documentary industry that I was so used to when I was living there, where, I think I if I tell people, like, if I tell you I'm a documentary filmmaker, you'll say, oh, great, that's so cool. I think in Japan, I say that and people say, I think I'm in like public service or something. Like, it's like somehow I'm like doing like it's like an informational kind of, like, maybe for older people, like some sort of like kind of not boring, but like, news type of thing. I think documentary doesn't have that same exciting ring to it in Japan. And I think it's because whether it's TV documentaries that are still heavily narrated and it's kind of like a typical kind of documentary, or there's these kind of, like, of course we have these legendary documentary filmmakers that have kind of been coming up, but they have such a specific way of saying what documentaries are in Japan. What I'm trying to do, I think there's not really someone like me that's kind of like spends hundreds of hours and really thinks about, like lots and lots of microphones everywhere and kind of like do it in the Western way, telling stories about Japan. And so I'm hoping that I can lead by example in a way to expand, like in Japan, what it means to make a documentary. So it's not just a certain kind of documentary that people just think is a documentary. I think there's a lot of work to be done there still. And I'm trying to create that, I'm trying to get, I think, like, if enough interesting documentaries are made in Japan, like Japanese audience will be excited about it. It's like a chicken and egg in a way. I think for documentaries, there's still a lot of growth that can happen to kind of catch up with how the industries are in other countries, especially in the West. And I'm trying to make that happen.
And future projects, what are you working on next? You have any plans?
Well, this elementary school film is my third feature, but my second film in Japan. The previous one I made about Japanese high school baseball, which again, it's a film about baseball, but it's actually a different way to examine Japanese society. It's kind of like an extreme part of Japanese culture where we kind of love these high school boys playing baseball every summer, and a lot of the boys have shaved heads and quite like disciplined, and what does this mean? And I think I did that with high school baseball, and now I've done elementary school. My next film, I think I need to do like a trilogy, I feel like. And I think the next film I need to now explore, I've done a lot with education and children, and I want to examine the world of adults in Japan. What does this all become? Maybe a big Japanese company, kind of following them for a while, kind of maybe in a moment of change, because I think that these days a 20 something year old Japanese person and a 60, 70-year-old Japanese person is very different. Like the way that the country is changing so quickly, and how we think we should be as a society. And maybe this is the case around the world. And I think so I want to explore the world of adults in like a moment of post-COVID change to figure out again, like what is Japan, where is Japan headed? I'm always curious about finding a kind of like an arena where I can examine this and then see what's there, spend time, a year or two always to examine it and then kind of put it together in the way I saw it. Again, as a way to share with the world. You know, I think Japan is known for its sushi and anime, and that's all great. But I think there's just like more ways to think about Japan. Answer this question, like, why is Japan the way it is? You know, I like to explore the answers to that in my own way and share it with the world. And I think in return, people in Japan also have a new way of seeing themselves because I do have access to this perspective of how Japan is seen from the outside. So I think I will do a project that I can kind of maximize on all of that in a way that, you know, uniquely I can. That's my goal, at least.
Mm-hmm. Would be interesting if you spend some time in Toho shooting for a couple of years, see what's happening there, and no one knows what's happening there.
in Toho,
Yeah.
the film company. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, I think ideally it would be like a big Japanese company that the world knows the name and maybe thinks they're like amazing, but what's going on inside and what the challenges are, what they're thinking about, because I think that'll become the beacon of again where society is headed. And that's I'm very hopeful about Japan. I think having left Japan once and appreciated things I didn't appreciate, I just have a lot of hope for Japan. But I think, you know, I want to use this perspective, or, you know, I think if people just live in Japan, you forget about the normal things that are extraordinary. And then, of course, like some people, when you leave, you also see the great things of cultures outside. And I think what I'm trying to do is combine the best of everything for myself and my family, including my son, but also like find hope in the future of a country, but also maybe question and challenge things that I'm not quite sure about. And I'm not a writer, I'm a filmmaker, so I do it kind of indirectly in a film. But this is what interests me, you know, and I hopefully can continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good luck with the premiere and your next project.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
and see you soon. Okay, bye.
Bye.